Okay, welcome everyone to this RFF-CMCC webinar. We are very happy to have a great speaker today. The speaker is Sara Lovisolo. She is Group Sustainability Manager at London Stock Exchange, and she's also one of the 35 experts that the European Commission has put together, and we work for almost a year and a half right now on their Sustainable Finance Initiative. So she knows a lot about both the finance and policy implications of sustainable finance, which, as you know, it's a big topic, and one that also relates to our research, as Sara, I think, will in her presentation, which will talk about striving to align investment decision to 1.5 degree trajectories, since we're working a lot on this kind of trajectories. That's a nice connection to our work. Just a couple of words for those who are on our webinar connected by web today, not for the people in the room who I believe are familiar with this. Where are we? We are the European Institute on Economics and Environment, which is an institute which was established almost a year and a half ago, and this is a transatlantic partnership between Fondazione CMCC, the Italian Foundation of Climate, and Resources for the Future, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and was done a lot of work on environmental economics, and we're very happy about this transatlantic partnership. And we mostly do research related to climate change and sustainability. Just for the people participating online, as your information, to participate in the Q&A, just follow the instruction listed here. Just use the question menu provided by the GoToWebinar, and I will moderate the questions, and we will refer back to Sara for questions at the end of our talk. That's it. I think I'll leave the floor to Sara. Thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you, Massimo, for the invitation. I'll take this opportunity to explore with you how finance, and sustainable finance in particular, has tried to incorporate science into investment tools. And we also explore the limitations of those efforts so far, hoping that this will lead to better solutions in the future. I will start by briefly discussing what sustainable finance is, how we interpret that currently, especially in Europe. We'll briefly touch upon the current understanding of what Paris alignment is from an investment perspective. We'll delve into the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, and then we will explore two actions from the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, the EU Climate Benchmarks, and the EU Taxonomy. And I'll briefly open the floor to sort of a critical assessment of the solutions we're putting forward now, and then we'll take questions. So, what is sustainable finance from both a policy perspective and an investment perspective? Sustainable finance has fundamentally two imperatives. One is an impact imperative, that is, drive finance towards sustainable assets. So, assets that mean some societal and environmental need. The second imperative of sustainable finance, fundamentally to protect the financial system from ESG risks, from environmental, social, and governance risks. This is a risk management perspective, is strongly connected to financial stability. But whether you follow an impact approach or a risk management approach, the theory of change by which your decisions affect the real economy is through providing a lower cost of capital to sustainable assets. So it's the transmission mechanism by which all investment or activities make a difference in the real economy is by lowering the cost of capital. Nothing else matters. And I think this is a key point we always have to bear in mind to understand the two policy measures that I will discuss later on. These two definitions, these imperatives, are formalized in the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, which was launched in March 2018. So they have a sort of relevance that goes beyond what practitioners in the financial market understand, in the sense that that understanding has been formalized into policy. What do investors mean by aligning investment decisions to the Paris Agreement? It's a very controversial area. There are many associations of investors that are working currently to agree on a common shared definition of what Paris alignment means. There's no proper definition out there. There's no global framework or methodology available. But what normally practitioners understand by Paris alignment is that somehow your investment portfolio is compatible with the allocation of the carbon budget and the technology and industrial mix that is described by some Paris 2-degree scenario, or below 2-degree scenario. Of course, a scenario is a picture, as a snapshot of a future state. The problem is that we need to add time to that. So how do we move from a state, the situation in 2019, 2020, and we slowly get to the 2050 situation? This is the key problem. What is the state of the art of thinking around Paris alignment within the European Union and within the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance that has been delivered over the past 2 years? I will describe very briefly this action plan. This is made up of 10 actions, but the key 2 actions, in my view, are for sure the EU climate benchmarks that explicitly mention Paris alignment, and the creation of a classification system for sustainable activities, which is a tool to get to the vision of the European Union to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Carbon neutrality by 2050 in the European Union has not been legislated yet. The new Commission, the one that was elected, has a EU Green Deal at the center of their program. For now, what is being legislated is, under the Paris Agreement, a series of 2030 targets regarding emissions, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. So these are the legislated targets. Any financial tool that help raise funding to achieve those targets is in some way Paris aligned, in the sense that it helps achieve the policy targets associated in the European Union with the Paris Agreement. These funding needs vary depending on whether you look at the 2050 carbon neutrality situation, where the funding gap is estimated in 290 billion euros, or you have a lower estimate just based on the 2030 targets of 175 billion euros. You can find the source. These are estimates by the European Investment Bank. There's a big regulatory effort underway. Following the report by the high-level expert group on sustainable finance published in January 2018, the Commission published in March 2018 this action plan on financing sustainable growth. Then they set up a technical expert group on sustainable finance, whose mission was to help the Commission figure out the technical details to implement some of the proposed measures. This technical expert group delivered 4 reports in June this year, and what happens next is that the Commission will base the delegated act supporting some of the legislative proposals, which will happen in early 2020. It's a very busy. This is a very busy slide. It tries to summarize the 10 actions of the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. There's another one following with the other five actions, but the key takeaway here is that the 10 measures covered by the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance try to address all elements of the financial system value chain and try to remove a number of barriers. These barriers are around the lack of definitions of what is green. So for this reason, the establishment of a sustainable taxonomy or a classification of sustainable finance activities. The fact that retail investors don't know what is a green product, and so creation of a green label. The fact that advisors to retail investors sometimes do not ask questions around sustainability, and so forcing banks and other advisors to ask about the preferences of investors around sustainable finance can mobilize further resource towards sustainable finance. And the fact that currently investors do not use sustainability indices is also bound to be removed. And for this reason, the EU decided to introduce 2 new types of benchmarks and also disclosures for all existing benchmarks. The Commission will also deliver a study on all the ESG ratings. ESG means environmental, social, and governance. It's investment jargon. The Commission is going to deliver sort of a mapping of all the tools that are out there used to categorize the sustainability of companies, securities, and so on. Number 7 is the key measure, the fact that from 2020, all investors in Europe will be mandated to integrate sustainability considerations in their governance, risk management, and investment decisions. So this is a massive upscaling of sustainable investment in Europe. There's also the possibility to, and the European Banking Authority is working on it, to create incentives for banks to lend, to provide finance to green assets. And also work is underway on the implementation of some IFRS standards, accounting standards that were sort of hindering the ability of investors to invest sustainably. But now we are just focusing on during this webinar, 2 measures, so the EU climate benchmarks and the EU taxonomy. You can see here the final report from the technical expert group on sustainable finance. This report was published on the 30th of September, following consultation over the summer with investors, index providers, companies. And the whole process follows the fact that there is a new piece of legislation approved by the European Parliament and approved by the European Council that says fundamentally 2 things. First, this legislation, this is a regulation, so it means that has maximum regulatory convergence. This regulation does not have to be translated into national regulation, so it has immediately, it comes into force with immediate effect, and introduces the minimum standards for 2 types of benchmarks, the EU climate transition benchmark and the EU Paris-aligned benchmark. So 2 new investment tools that are addressing the transition to a low carbon economy. And a second measure that we're not discussing today is the fact that all indices will need to disclose two things: Paris alignment. So there's this expectation that whatever index, even the big ones like the S&P 500, the FTSE 100, the FTSE in Italy, will have to tell whether or not they meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And in addition to that, there is a set of KPIs, of ESG KPIs, that every benchmark is expected to disclose. So this is a massive transparency effort, unprecedented in any other jurisdiction. Why did the Commission feel the need to introduce these two climate benchmarks? Because previous consultations flagged that investors felt there was a lack of transparency on how other sustainability benchmarks were designed. Many low carbon indices out there, but with methodologies that took account of different considerations, and limited uptake by investors. So despite the fact that many investors commit to sustainable investment, at the end of the day, investors were always using standard benchmarks, not sustainability ones, to measure the performance of their investment. To change all of these, and with the risk of being Washington, to change all of these new climate benchmarks, with the objective to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment. So that objective of sustainable finance that we mentioned at the beginning. And to be clear, the idea is to use the index as a tool to reorient finance towards those companies that are greener. In this way, the price of those securities goes up, the market capitalization of those companies is larger, and in this way, companies can use their leverage to raise more finance. So in general, you have this leverage ratio, which is the relationship between the amount of debt you have and the equity you have. The larger the equity you have, the greater amount of debt, the larger amount of debt you can raise. So this is the mechanism. It's just that. So to be clear, an index is not changing the economy out there. If you invest sustainably through an index, you're just investing more in greener securities than you have on the market. So the index does not simply replicate or mirror the composition of the capital markets on a stock exchange, but it overweights the companies that are greener and underweights the companies that are brown. So this is the mechanism. Other things that a benchmark does is to measure performance. So maybe you are not a passive investor, that is an investor that just replicates an index to make investment decisions. You are an active investor that picks stocks in a discretionary way, but still you use a benchmark to measure the performance of your fund. So even in that case, using a climate benchmark might show that your environmentally themed fund is compared to an appropriate benchmark, and so we are not just capturing the financial performance, but also the environmental performance of the fund. An index is used to choose the investment universe to start from. So you take an index and then you say, okay, this is the starting investment universe, and then slowly I take these things out because they do not meet my investment beliefs. It's a financial instrument for passive investment, so investment that just replicates the composition of an index, and can be an incentive tool, because you can go to a company and say, look, if you become greener, you will be included in this index, hence you will get more investment to your securities, and your price, your stock price will go up, and so on, as we said it before. So these are the use cases of benchmarks. The official definition of these two climate benchmarks reads as follows. So an EU climate transition benchmark is one where the underlying assets are selected, weighted, or excluded in a manner that the resulting benchmark portfolio is on a decarbonization trajectory. On the other hand, an EU Paris-aligned benchmark is one whose portfolio, whose resulting portfolio has overall greenhouse gas emissions that are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So this definition was introduced by the Parliament. So it was something that Parliament came up with. What in the tag we had to do was to ensure that something actionable, investable, meaningful could be created based on these two definitions. The first is a portfolio of companies that have maybe set objectives, decarbonization objectives. Maybe they're brown now, but they have set decarbonization objectives that will lead them to lower emissions in the future. In the EU Paris-aligned benchmark, you want to see actions already being taken and clear in a clear allocation of the carbon budget that is already compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This summarizes the key the objectives already mentioned before, so I won't spend much time here. I will describe to you what we came up with to ensure we could translate this mandate we had from the Parliament and from the European Council into some investment tools. So first of all, we decided we would pick a climate scenario. The IPC 1.5 degree report was issued in November last year. We decided that of all the scenarios that are covered by in that report, we would look at the group of scenarios that make the assumptions of limited or no overshoot. So at most, in those scenarios, the average global temperature rises to 1.6 degrees to then reconverge to 1.5. And we apply this scenario, group of scenarios, to both the climate transition benchmarks and the Paris-aligned benchmark. You can see below the acronym of the two benchmarks. Clearly, this is the most important decision we had to make. We could have chosen another group of scenarios. We decided that we didn't want to give climate carbon storage usage technologies too much of a role in defining the investment choices. So we wanted to apply a precautionary principle and say, let's stick to the technologies that are commercial now, that are in operation, and you can invest now on capital markets. Then we created allocation constraints. So we said the only way for this tool to work is that the portfolio, so the universe you're invested in, represents an economy as a whole. So if you just invest in renewable energy or climate technology, you are not controlling for all the other sectors of the economy. So we provide this constraint, given that there are no established methodologies, as I said before, about what Paris alignment is. We thought that the only way was to ensure that we had a sort of a mini economy in the portfolio and drive the decarbonization of this mini economy that should be still exposed to high carbon sectors. This is the, let's say, practical rule of thumb solution we identified to ensure the downscaling of these 1.5 degree scenarios. We don't know We don't have a fine downscaling by sector, by country, by company. So let's keep a portfolio that it's a sort of mini economy that represents how the world operates, and ensure there is a slow decarbonization. We decided to translate the scenarios into a regular decarbonization path. So we are expecting these indices to self-decarbonize by 7% each year compared to itself, at least 7%. And we want also a relative decarbonization to the wider economy, let's say, or the starting universe, that is lower in the case of the climate transition benchmark, so a 30% reduction in aggregated greenhouse gas emissions for the climate transition benchmark, and a 50% reduction for the Paris-aligned benchmark. And then we created also a constraint on the ratio of green versus brown assets, or sectors of the economy included in the index. So we wanted that this green to brown ratio is the same as the starting universe for the climate transition benchmark, and much stronger, 4 times as high, for the Paris-aligned benchmark. So this idea is that we just differentiate the 2 benchmarks based on the intensity of the assumptions or the constraints. So fundamentally, it's the same mechanism, but made stronger in the case of the Paris-aligned benchmark. It also includes here the details, so you can find them. It's a very short table. You can find the summary in the report. You can see that in the case of the EU Paris-aligned benchmark, we also have exclusions. Sector exclusions or activity exclusions were strongly wanted by the Parliament. So what we say is that companies that have some exposure to coal, oil, natural gas, and electricity produced with a higher than a certain threshold should not be included. And this was part of the mandate we had to include this sort of sector constraint. So what did we do with scenarios? Fundamentally, we elaborated on the carbon budgets of those 1.5 degree scenarios with limited or no overshoot. Clearly, starting from 2020, we know that emissions are actually going up; they are not going down. And so, starting from a situation in 2020 where emissions have gone up, actually, we assume a self-decarbonization at least of 7% year on year, very regular until 2050. Very simple way of the scaling. For sure, this is not going to happen, right, in reality. But our virtual tool has to deliver that. So the world will keep, we know emissions will keep going up, unfortunately, but we are forcing more investment to go to those portfolios that enable this decarbonization. Even then, if it's just virtual, it means we are overweighting companies that do decarbonize, and we underweight companies that whose emissions go up. So, of course, it's virtual. This will not immediately reflect in changes in the real economy, but it will only translate into changes in the cost of capital for those companies that are decarbonizing. So we want to leave time for the Q&A at the end, so I want to spend around 10 minutes on the taxonomy technical report. This is the more controversial measure of the EU action plan. It's considered a flagship measure. Many jurisdictions outside Europe look at the EU and the work they're doing to avoid having to draft their own taxonomy. So all eyes on the EU regarding this piece of work. From a regulatory perspective, the situation is different compared to the benchmark. So in this case, the legislation is not completed yet. So Parliament, the European Parliament and the European Council are still negotiating the legal framework around the taxonomy, but the technical expert group has already delivered 400 pages report with a list of activities that significantly contribute to mitigation and adaptation. So we're not sure what happens to this work. It will depend on the result, on the outcomes of the trialogue or the negotiation between Commission, Parliament and European Union. But in any case, it's testament to the fact that you can create a list of these activities, which many people were skeptical about. Many people, when we started work, said it's impossible, you cannot create a list of sustainable activities. What the original mandate from the Commission asked us to do was to create a list of activities, economic activities that substantially contribute to 6 environmental objectives that I will describe later on. Activities that do not significantly harm any other environmental objective. So if you're significantly contributing to mitigation, climate change mitigation, you should not significantly harm biodiversity, for example. So this was this sort of a balance between the various objectives. These activities have also to comply with minimum social safeguards, and all these criteria, so significant contribution, do no significant harm, and minimum safeguards, are translated into technical screening criteria. So quantitative measures that enable you as an investor to say, yes, this activity is taxonomy compliant or not. The 6 environmental objectives are the ones you see here. So mitigation, adaptation, water and marine resource, circular economy and waste management, pollution prevention and control, and biodiversity, so protection of healthy ecosystems. The work of the TEG just covers 1 and 2. We address the other 4 objectives through the do no significant harm principle analysis. The taxonomy is a list of activities. It's not a list of companies. Companies can be active across multiple sectors, so you cannot make this equivalence. The taxonomy is not associated with a specific asset class, so it's not associated with equity or with bonds. It should be flexible and useful for investment decision across asset classes. By the way, the benchmarks we saw before are fundamentally equity benchmarks. So in terms of asset classes involved, they are limited, and when you look at bonds, criteria should be probably different. And the taxonomy is dynamic. So we know technology evolves. We know that thresholds that are now best in class might be overcome by technology develops in the future. So we are completely aware that all these, this is a starting point, and there is a governance associated with the taxonomy that will ensure that the taxonomy stays up to date. The Commission, if they manage to achieve an agreement, will create a sustainable finance platform, a permanent body that will be tasked with making the taxonomy always up to date and in line with technology and policy developments. The key issue of the taxonomy is the fact that it's about green. And we got pressure from Parliament, from many other institutions about creating a brown taxonomy. Because from a risk perspective, for example, what financial authorities say is that this is a good tool for impact, as we said before, because it drives investment towards activities that are contributing to the transition, but it's not a tool for risk. And, you know, sustainable finance has the two imperatives, impact and risk management. It's creating a brown taxonomy is not part of our mandate. What is not in the taxonomy might be gray. Pharmaceuticals, finance, a lot of activities that are not in the taxonomy are not brown. So it's not, you know, something you can flip on its head and say, okay, what is not here is brown. Absolutely not. So this element of a tool for managing risk is missing. Other authorities are asking for it, but we're not. It was not part of the report. So could this taxonomy look like? Fundamentally, it's a series. It's a screening of the European sector breakdown provided by a NACE, so-called NACE framework. So this acronym NACE, it's an acronym of French words that fundamentally means the Eurostat classification of economic activities. We started from those activities that contribute the most to emissions. So at the top, you have, for example, air conditioning, right? Because the approach followed by the Eurostat is about looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And agriculture has a big role to play here. So agriculture is responsible for the most significant emissions. So it's a demand side approach. It's not a supply side approach. And based on the sectors that are contributing the most to the emissions in Europe, we've unpacked them and identified those pockets of activities that could contribute to the transition. And then we carried out the do no significant harm analysis. We covered 67 economic activities in 7 sectors. So you see them in terms of the contribution to EU greenhouse gas emissions. We also included information communication technology, especially because the projections for the future are really high in terms of energy usage. And we distinguished these 67 activities into groups. The greening of activities, that is, activities that are greening a sector of the economy. So low carbon agriculture is greening agriculture. Low carbon steel is greening the steel sector, steel production sector. And then we are looking at the greening by activities. There are activities that do not green themselves, but other sectors of the economy. So, for example, precision, all the software for precision agriculture is not greening the ICT sector, but is greening agriculture. So we also looked at those enabling activities that can transform buildings, transport, agriculture, and so on. Here we are presenting an example of a mitigation activity that is not the obvious one. So this is steel manufacturing, which is not what you would expect on a green taxonomy. It's not a classic low carbon renewable energy or electric vehicles activity. Here we've chosen steel manufacturing. We identify for this activity, but for all activities, a principle, metric, and a threshold to measure the transition to a low carbon economy. And in the setting of these thresholds, you have where scenario analysis kicks in, because these are approximations to carbon budgets that are compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. For the various outputs of the steel industry, hot metals, sintered ore, iron casting, electric, all these activities, we've taken the benchmark of the EU ETS, or the EU emission trading scheme. And the idea is that you have to exceed that threshold, and you know that this threshold will be ratcheted up over time as the cap for emission is lowered. So it's a cap and trade system, and so we've used that system as the source of our threshold. We have here you can see the threshold set in June 2019, but over time these thresholds, this threshold will change. Then, with the help of hundreds of experts, so this was not carried out by 35 people, we involved an additional 180 people from all industries to deliver this analysis. We've also identified standards that this steel production activity should comply with, to ensure we don't have significant harm on water, circular economy, pollution, and ecosystems. In some cases, the standards are not there, so we had to use other type of analysis. But this is what, in the case of steel, the standards were out there, it was possible to apply them. Of course, if this is an investment tool, you can see there's a lot of work here for an investor. The investors have to check to make sure that they are taxonomy compliant, that all these criteria are met to include an activity in their investment portfolio. And here is, here is the due diligence that an investor has to take to ensure that their investment portfolio is aligned. So first, you identify the activity conducted by the company, which is not easy, because many companies do not break down their activities or the revenues per activity. You don't know how much revenues Toyota derives from electric vehicles. They don't say so. So if you want to invest in Toyota, they do electric vehicles for sure, but you don't know the percentage, the ratio of the revenues deriving from that. So this is the first problem you have as an investor. The company has to disclose the fact that they meet or not a threshold. So in the case of electricity generation, the fact that they are lower, the average emissions per kilowatt hour are lower than 100 grams CO2 equivalent. This is the easy piece. It's very easy for utilities to disclose this, but many other thresholds are not so easy. Think of the steel industry seen before. The hardest bit is to verify that the do no significant harm DNSH criteria are met, because not many companies are disclosing on that, and do a due diligence on this on the social safeguard, and then you have to quantify the percentage of taxonomy compliant activities in your portfolio. Here you can see an example of how this calculation is made. It's just equity, so based on 3 companies, depending on the weight that the company has in the portfolio and the percentage of taxonomy alliance, you come to a number. In this case, 54% of the fund is taxonomy eligible. Please note that this is the only use case, mandatory use case of the taxonomy. The only proposed use case is for funds that are marketed as environmental to disclose the percentage of exposure to the taxonomy they have. Only mandated use, but in any case, even though this is the only mandated use, there are a lot of concerns on the market about the dangers that introducing this tool might bring to sectors of the economy, costs for banks and investors. Is the taxonomy useful? We think so. So people tend to see the dangers, we see the opportunities. It can be used as a tool to help raise capital. You see here the example, for example, of a company raising a bond. If they can demonstrate that the projects will lead to meeting the threshold set by taxonomy, they qualify for a EU Green Bond standard. So we think it drives investment decisions. The key is that we have finally a quantitative measure. So if you make an investment to your steel plant And this investment ensures that you meet the threshold set by the EU ETS and by the taxonomy. Okay, we have something, a benchmark that help us make a sound investment decision. It's not, we are preventing greenwashing or greenwishing sometimes. Sometimes it's a matter of thinking that what you're doing is so impactful, and actually it's not, because the threshold is, you're so far from this threshold, actually. Conclusion. So it's early days. We started to experiment with the alignment of investment decisions with the Paris, with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, where science can help in making sure that the scenarios are understandable, it can be translated into or downscaled into sectors of the economy, country breakdowns. The assumptions that underlie scenarios are political, can have a real impact on policy making because they can orientate future policies and investment decisions. So there's a real responsibility on scientists in developing those scenarios, knowing that they're not just theoretical, they can really be taken by investors, by policymakers, and turned into actionable policies. So there's a risk there for you, and we probably demonstrated how, a naive or, let's say, simplistic some solutions can be. Clearly, what we advise the Commission is to ensure that any methodology is reviewed at least every 3 years to take account of improved science, improved methodologies. So please let me know if you have any questions.
So I will take a couple of questions from the webinar and then open up the floor for questions from the people participating. I think there were almost 80 people participating remotely, and two questions, if I can summarize a bit. One is on benchmarking. You showed us these two benchmarks of increasing and differentiated stringency. So the rationale of the questions was, which ones you think, what are the biggest differences? I think you showed it compellingly, but also where do you think which one of the two benchmarks will actually be the one? Then in a way we prevail and become a standard over the other, because there's clearly quite a difference in stringency between the two, despite both having a common base. Now the second, of course, on taxonomy. Of course, taxonomy, the way you interpret taxonomy, the way you connect it also to what Paris alignment means, can lead to different thresholds, very different thresholds. And so maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how those thresholds were identified. You said connection to the emission trading schemes, and to what extent these thresholds can change depending on your overall objectives. And I think here also the scenarios obviously can play a key role, because they project forward also terms of ambitions of emission reduction by sector and activity. Some activities are harder to decarbonize than others, and obviously should not be subject to the same thresholds than others are, out of consideration of cost effectiveness. And how do you see, especially in practice, that these benchmarks, and I guess the taxonomy also can translate into lower cost of capital and facilitate the impact and the risk management objectives that you laid out at the beginning? I think these are others coming, but I would maybe ask you to answer questions first, and then people from the floor can come in, and then I will look if there are others.
Thank you. So on the two benchmarks, the two are positioned very differently. So the climate transition benchmark is considered a tool that can be used for core investment decisions. So can be applied to core portfolios, because there are more companies in those benchmarks. So the risk is lower, because when you look at returns, you always have to look at risk-adjusted returns. So it's a more investable, more liquid tool that we think could be used for low-risk core allocations of investors, the mainstream investors. The Paris-aligned benchmark instead is a tool that could be used by, let's say, niche investors. So for investments that are more ambitious and that required higher commitment and higher risk on the part of the asset owner that gives the mandate. So in terms of capital, cost of capital, you know, it all depends on the net effect. So the first is less ambitious, but will draw more capital to companies that are, you know, less ambitious in their objectives. The Paris-aligned benchmark will be dialing more strongly in the direction of green companies, but probably the assets under management will be lower. So I believe that the more moderate tool will have the greatest impact in terms of lowering the cost of capital, because it will be more widely adopted, more widely used. On how we set the thresholds for the taxonomy, we followed many approaches depending on the industry, depending on the literature available and the standards available. The approach was sometimes benchmark-led, as in the case of the steel. So we had a benchmark out there, we said, let's use it. Another benchmark you can use is it's the clean development mechanism. So the clean development mechanism is another area where you can find benchmarks, especially for agriculture, you find those. Another approach where you don't have the literature, because these sectors are new to the low carbon transition literature, is to use a best-in-class approach. I was leading on the ICT sector. What we decided to do, for example, was to just look at energy efficiency, not emissions, because it considers emissions depending on the grid, so not on the efforts of the data center. And we said you have to comply with the EU standard on energy efficiency in data centers, which evolves every year. So every year, depending on the existing technology, they raise the bar, and so it's an evolving. It's an evolving. So this is not based on the end point, but on the so-called best-in-class approach. You have to be the best in your sector. Of course, some of those thresholds are the result of negotiations, because we had a lot of outreach, a lot of trade associations that wanted to decide, well, look, the data is not there. Don't set a threshold for which we cannot provide you with the data. For example, in the buildings, the energy efficiency certificates across Europe are completely different. So you just have to use a best-in-class approach based on the country where the property asset is based. So we didn't have a single approach, but sometimes you rely on standards that have been designed to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and so it's not a direct link, but an indirect link. And the cost of capital here, it's based on the system incentives for the taxonomy, the system incentives that will become in place. So we see authorities in Europe forcing the financial system to invest in a sustainable way. So the European Banking Authority is already stress testing banks to try to understand their exposure to the green and the brown economy. And so even if you don't have a mandatory case, we are expecting banks, for example, to use the taxonomy to demonstrate to their authorities that the exposures to green is right, is aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So it's a matter of carrot and stick that can lead to reducing the cost of capital. So if many banks are chasing green assets, as we see, for example, in China, this is already happening there. If many banks are chasing green assets because they have a sort of policy goal or expectations to comply with, then the interest rates for those assets will go down. This is the expectation, the transmission mechanism from taxonomy to cost of capital.
Any questions? You have to come here you have to sit here, otherwise you don't want to hear, you still have about 60 people online.
So, thank you for the very, very nice presentation. I think it's nice to see how the sustainable finance is being put into practice. I actually have perhaps a broader philosophical question, which seems this is a tool to attract private capital towards the best kid in the class. What happens to the least best kid in the class, which is, if you're thinking about, let me give a very simplistic example. If this were to start working tomorrow, then nobody would invest in aviation anymore, simply because there are no technology options out there to provide more sustainable travel by plane, let's put it that way. So how do you balance that with the need to invent or innovate in certain sectors to ensure that they're not behind? And how does this fit into the broader portfolio of other policies, perhaps, that the European Union is putting aside, is putting into place to ensure that no European is actually left behind, both in terms of sectors and citizens? So
thank you for the question. So this is the so-called issue of the just transition, right? And the fact of not leaving behind sectors of the economy. It's part of the Green Deal to ensure there is a just transition. Probably I wouldn't look at aviation, which is not part of the taxonomy currently for the concerns you mentioned, but there are other more obvious candidates for this issue. Especially, you have countries relying on coal at the moment, heavily relying on coal, and they might not be able to shift completely to renewable energy in time for 2030 or for 2050. The issue of the just transition is even broader. So the problem of, does anyone deserve a washing machine in emerging markets, right? This is the key topic. So I think that the problem of the just transition is not so much a European problem where you can have subsidies. And for example, for the transition in Eastern Europe, the US set up a fund to compensate for transition, to retrain workers from sectors that will be inevitably left behind. The more equitable problem of an equitable transition is with respect to the fact that we have a number of emerging markets coming online, becoming middle-income countries, and will want to have access to energy, access to transport. And so how we balance that? How do we balance that? Is it realistic to think that those economies will leapfrog fossil fuels and go straight to renewable, to sustainable transport and so on? It's a big point that scenarios cover. So the problem of scenarios are very often about making assumptions about this. Are we expecting consumptions to be constrained, or are we letting billions of people to get access to consumption and energy? And so this is the big issue. The European Union just accounts for 10% of the emissions globally, and so our solutions might be really, really limited, regardless of, let's say, the defined efforts we're making in terms of setting thresholds.
So my question is about the taxonomy. I think you mentioned that it depends on the activities. I mean, it was breaking down the activities. So what about the companies? Let's say I was thinking about manufacturer of solar panels. So they may have all the activities not green or like energy intensive, but at the end, the final product is something that other sectors use and it is green. But how do you account for that? The final product will be something green.
Thank you. The taxonomy is just about that. So to free you from carbon footprinting. So why do you need a taxonomy? Because the other way of measuring transitions is to do the carbon footprint of everything, which is a lot of work. What the taxonomy tells you, we know that maybe there are emissions associated with production of electric vehicles, but what we want to design is a sort of jigsaw puzzle of economic activities that put together contribute to a sustainable economy. Electric vehicles now have low or high emissions depending on the grid they are connected to. So in theory, an electric vehicle in Poland has higher emissions than electric vehicle in Costa Rica, I would say. But the taxonomy is an alternative to the carbon footprint. So if you look at 2050, a scenario in 2050 where the grid is green, where you have sustainable steel that is used for wind farm, because also the wind farm made of steel and that has a lot of emissions. If you put together all these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, it will be sustainable. So don't bother with doing your carbon footprinting or life cycle analysis of every element, because this is the alternative. And still we have on the market carbon footprinting approaches. And from France, for example, they have this Article 7.3 that fundamentally asks everyone to measure the carbon footprint of a portfolio. The alternative is to look at sector exposure. So are you exposed to sectors of the economy that significantly contribute? Don't bother with carbon footprinting.
Maybe a last question is, what about companies who are exposed internationally to many markets outside Europe as well? And would those be kind of taxonomy apply across the board?
The issue of regulatory convergence is a big one. On Friday, around the IMF meetings in Washington, the Commission set up an international platform on sustainable finance, inviting other jurisdictions to discuss policy convergence on a number of issues. If you're an investor and you are, based in the US, what happens? So you don't feel any constraint in your home country, but you want to market a product in Europe, and all of a sudden you have to develop the knowledge, the expertise, and the governance to ensure that you meet the requirements. That's why you cannot sell products to European investors. So as long as the EU is a strong sustainable investment market, and as long as we ensure that all our private investors start mobilizing resource, we feel there is the economic incentive for a Japanese investors or US investors to adopt fundamentally globally the requirements in order to be able to serve the European market. The other solution, so apart from the market-based solution, is to hope that the European Union's role in leading regulatory convergence is successful. So just to be clear, if the platform will launch on Friday, the US were not invited, are not part of that, but you have Japan, you have African countries. So you see that this problem of accelerating convergence globally is seen as a crucial element to ensure that we don't waste our time, because 2030 is approaching fast, and we cannot wait for every country to find their own solution or reinvent the wheel, consuming that. Piloting or experimentation in Europe has been already advanced.
All right, and we are an hour into the meeting, and I think on these notes of the importance of policy convergence, which I think we certainly all agree, I thank Sara. It's very nice to see Europe moving so fast on this and connecting Europeans with you. So thanks again for being here. And
thank you for the invitation.
And there will be, for those who are still there, so this is your CD. There will be a next, just remind you about the next webinar of CMCC, which will be a seasonal forecast of spring cold spells. So something like weather, I guess, especially for the other not agribusiness, which is certainly exposed to meteorological conditions, which will be held on November 5th, 2000. Hope you will join us for that one as well. Thank you.